We'll have these recorded for future reference. Hey, David, how are you? Good to see you.
Likewise, how you doing?
Good. Hanging in there.
Good, good. I just ran into a friend from college I haven't seen in 10 years.
Oh, that's always super
Just
fun.
walk in, hi.
That's great.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Seems like some folks are still joining, which is super great. Okay. Folks coming in from the waiting room. Okay. I think we can probably get started from here. Thanks for dealing with some of we did some Zoom tweaks, changes to make this run a little bit better. Hopefully, fingers crossed. But we're still working out the kinks there. So there should be a chat feature available to you. We won't do like a Q&A or anything like that. But purpose of these meetings, like always, is to hold a space and time for folks who are working in housing planning and the intersection between housing and growth management and the opportunity to kind of have a conversation or ask questions of DLCD as it relates to housing planning and kind of latest and greatest, but also an opportunity for DLCD to kind of share some information. So if you haven't been to one of these before, typically it works where DLCD spends just I don't know, 30 minutes or so providing updates, and the remainder, the balance of the time is for folks in the room to ask questions, provide comments, so on and so forth. So really an opportunity to have a dialogue, a back and forth, and no real rigid agenda, and we can kind of go with where folks will want to take it. So in terms of the light agenda that we've got for today, it's four things. It is grants. We'll provide just a real quick update on the housing planning assistance grant process and those notices. We'll talk a little bit about the administrative rulemaking process for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. That's really going to be less on the policy or what's included there and more about process, where we go from here. We've kind of done a transition into a more formal process at this point. We'll talk a little bit about the permitted produced report and survey that got sent around, and reminder of that and the deadlines and so on and so forth. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the upcoming rulemaking or process that or policy development process that DLCD has been directed to do under the 25-27 biennial process. So that's the agenda for today. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, raise your hand, use all the features as you would like throughout the meeting, and I'll kind of just jump in with grants then. So on Thursday of last week, the department sent around a notice of intent to awards and some um, denial letters for housing planning assistance grants. We had, for probably the first time that at least I've been at DLCD, more requests for housing grants than we've been able to actually fund, which is both, I don't know, if that's a good sign or a bad sign. Probably a good sign of folks that folks are interested in doing the work and recognizing the need for that, but kind of bad news in terms of the level of funding that DLC had available to fund those much needed projects. So in terms of the actual numbers themselves, we received 99 applications for 99 projects across the state. And we're able to fund a total of 87 of them across the housing division projects and projects that were funded through the Housing Accountability and Production Office, or HAPO, which is an exciting amount of funding that we're able to allocate out to local governments to do the again much needed housing planning work. So the projects that were funded, we kind of used a three-stage criteria for prioritization of those projects. The first priority of projects were those that were conducting work that was statutorily obligated in the 25-27 biennium. So these are projects like a housing production strategy or housing capacity analysis in those jurisdictions that are on the schedule or have a deadline that is occurs either 25, 26, or 27. The second priority for projects were kind of like, I don't know, I'll classify that, or also included in that first priority was housing planning projects in tribal governments. Kind of in that like second batch of priorities was related to kind of like follow-up work of housing planning work or work that was already kind of underway in terms of a good example is like a city had a housing production strategy that was approved and they submitted an application to actually implement some of that work. And then third priority was kind of a catch-all for work that wasn't statutorily obligated or was more like opting in nature. And so we tried our best to fund projects out of all of those categories, obviously trying to fill that first bucket up first. There's three pots of funding that those projects come out of. The first is kind of like a general technical assistance for housing. Those fund those kind of housing capacity analyses, housing production strategies. There's another bucket of funding that came from the passage of House Bill 2138. This is the governor's bill related to middle housing to fund some development code updates to implement provisions in that bill. And then the Housing Accountability and Production Office has technical assistance that they were deploying for what's called voluntary compliance or kind of any out of date, codes that the local government was generally aware of or wanted to go in and fix a particular element of their code that they knew was not in compliance with state housing laws. So those are the three general buckets that funding came out of. So in terms of kind of next steps for those, so if you work in a jurisdiction that did receive a notice of intent to award, you can be anticipating some further information from DLCD here in the next week or so related to your specific project. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to highlight here is there are instances where a city applied to do, a good example is the city applied to do both a housing capacity analysis and a housing production strategy. And you'll hear from DLCD saying, hey, we feel like we can fund just the housing capacity analysis portion of your project. And so we would like to work with you to identify and build out that scope of work. So a little bit more detail on what the intended scope of work for your specifically recommended and identified award is forthcoming. So that kind of kicks off this back and forth that the local government does with either a consultant team or just the agency to nail down a grant agreement and a scope of work with deliverables and timelines and all of that kind of stuff associated with kind of getting to project kickoff. We're hoping that throughout all of that back and forth and negotiations and conversations and scope development and all that kind of stuff, that we're kind of targeting the 1st of January as our self-imposed timeline for getting projects kicked off. So you can look forward to having all of 26 and a portion of 27 to work on your projects as they've been awarded. I am happy to answer any further questions on that grant process if anybody has them, or questions, commentary, so on and so forth. Really good set of applications, and it was pretty exciting to see all of the thought that folks had put into those projects and crafting timelines that were going to work for your communities. So thank you for the forethought in advance. I'll also throw out like a softball question in terms of improvements to that process. If anybody found both the application, the information that DLCD shared in like webinar format and using this venue, and the decision-making process, any of that you have comments or suggestions on, also fair game at this point.
Hi, Ethan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
This is Jacob Collister with the Lane Council of Governments. Just positive feedback really out of the gate that I thought the process delivered on the promise of straightforward. The tools were really nice. Like the sample scopes of work are always super helpful to just kind of get a sense for what you're thinking. I know that those will be iterated on, but just as far as starting to think about it, the templates were really helpful. Our representative was super helpful in making our way down the path. And so something that seemed kind of daunting initially was, I thought, really well supported. And I thought it was a pretty manageable lift. So thank you.
That's great to hear. Yeah. We are seeking to get to this future where a local government just has to like check a box in terms of trying to get a grant from the state, where we know that cities are going to be on these cycles of doing this planning work, and there should be support there for them to do that. And if it's just you fall within that biennium, it should be as simple as just checking a box to receive that funding. That's the goal that we're trying to get to. So and if we yeah, please do not be shy. If that process was anything other than smooth, please do let us know. That's always good to hear. Okay. Again, use the chat feature. Come on screen, raise your hand if you have anything. All right, I will move into just a rulemaking kind of status update on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. So that process on October 1st, the Secretary of State published what is called a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking in their bulletin. That is a formal process that takes place at the state anytime a state agency is updating in Oregon administrative rules. It's a indication that the Land Conservation and Development Commission is going to be holding a public hearing on any changes to Chapter 660 of administrative rules. In that notice of proposed rulemaking, what was included there is the culmination of, I don't even want to speculate, hundreds, thousands of hours of work and conversations with the housing division and local governments and advocates and community serving organizations and other state agencies to inform the implementation of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis that was codified in House Bill 2001 and House Bill 2889 in the 2023 legislative session. So to use a kind of a football analogy, October 1st marked like the 2-minute warning of the rulemaking process for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. It is a kind of formal process. It's a milestone that you hit in the rulemaking process of making that notice to hold the public hearing. And that's a good time in the rulemaking process to get a sense of where all of the rules are in their current status. I'm hoping, I don't know, maybe hopefully the chat feature works the way that we've intended, but maybe somebody from the housing division could grab that long, I don't know, not entirely digestible packet of the notice of proposed rulemaking and put it in the chat here. It's like 200 pages, but that's only because it includes like all of the attachments and all of the impact stuff. It's all of the things that we need to include in that notice, and the actual rule changes is a smaller chunk of that. It's still a little bit difficult to read and follow along. Thank you, Muddy. To read and follow along with. So on Thursday of this week, in the Land Conservation and Development Commission's packet of materials for their meeting, we'll be including kind of more bite-sized, readable, approachable versions of those rules broken down by division. So the rules of that are subject to this rulemaking include Division 7, Division 8, Division 21, and Division 24. So 4 divisions of rules are where we're making amendments. Division 7 is really a repeal, so it should be a very simple review on that one. But those amendments that will be published on the 9th of this week will include some staff commentary that include kind of like a plain language, more narrative description of what the amendments are attempting to achieve, like what's the policy intent of those amendments. So hopefully that's a little bit more digestible and readable, and you can find your way a little easier through that review, should you be interested or in following along. The that notice of proposed rulemaking that went out on the 1st is in advance of the Land Conservation Development Commission's public hearing that's going to be held on the 23rd of October. And I believe the latest I've heard is that agenda item is actually happening in the afternoon on the 23rd. And it's all virtual, it's all remote. So if you're interested in reviewing the rules or providing oral testimony to the LCDC, you're free to do that on the 23rd. You can also provide any written testimony or commentary or track changes, suggested edits, all of those kind of things are welcome in a written format. And you can do that either in advance of that LCDC public hearing or until November 7th of just in about a month from now. That's when we'll be closing public comment for those rules. And then we try to use the remaining amount of time in November to finalize the rules based on that feedback and the conversations that we've had with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, the various work groups and advisory committees, and LCDC to get to a set of draft rules that will go in front of Commission for adoption, for their consideration of adoption, I suppose, on December 4th of this year. So that's kind of a high-level overview of things of note for folks in this room to potentially keep an eye out for, which is the notice of public proposed rulemaking is already out. It's a very long and probably unreadable document that you can read now if you're interested. You can also wait for the 9th on Thursday to see a more digestible version, but all of that is in service of trying to get the information out there for folks to digest and provide public comment in advance of that public comment close and the public hearing on the 23rd. Any questions there or things, team, that I forgot to overview?
I think it was a good point to bring up digest right at the beginning of lunch.
Perfect. Yes, exactly. Yes. All right. So next, oh yes. Thank you. Jenna is reminding me that we should talk about a set of regional conversation information sessions that we're going to hold. But Barbara, before we do that, I'm queuing you up, Jenna, and then we'll go to you, Barbara, first.
I just wanted to ask if we have received one of the housing grants, we would comply with these new rules, correct?
Good question. Good question. Okay, so I'll do my best to keep this as simple as I can. Any of the projects that are being funded under this grant cycle are most likely going to be under the new rule paradigm. So any housing capacity analysis are going to be conducted under the rules that the commission is going to be adopting here in December. I'm trying to recall. I don't think there's a small window of opportunity though for local governments who have already started that housing capacity or any of that housing planning process to complete their housing planning work under the old paradigm, the old rules. However, all of that work needs to be totally done by January 1st of 2027. There's a deadline in statute that kind of is that's when we shut the lights out of the old paradigm and kind of start the new one. and none of the work that is based on the old rules process and the statutory framework can kind of like straddle or exceed or surpass that January 1st, 2027 deadline. That's when you kind of lose the safe harbor provisions or like that safety net from litigation or challenge at that time. So short answer to your question is yes, Barbara.
So as we move forward, if we received one of the grants, we really need to be looking at this new legislation as we look at negotiating a scope of work, correct?
Yes, yes.
Thank
correct.
you.
Thank you. All right. Jenna, do you want to talk through the information sessions?
Yeah, happy to.
Thank you.
Folks may have received already an invitation to at least one of 4 information sessions we're having as part of the ONA rulemaking. And this will include an overview of some of the major changes in the draft rules. Maybe some of you have already had a chance to take a peek at what's in the rules, but it is over 200 pages. So this information session is really designed to help summarize some of those key changes and then direct you to some of the where you can find that language in the draft rules to help focus your review and help inform public comments. And so there will be 4 information sessions. The first one is happening tomorrow from 2 to 4, and that is geared towards jurisdictions in the Portland metro region. There's 2 happening next week on October 13th, starting in the morning at 10 a.m., focused for coastal communities, and then another one in the afternoon on October 13th at 1:30 for cities over 10,000 outside of the metro area. And then our 4th one happening October 20th at 10 a.m. for cities under 10,000. And please reach out to us if you didn't receive an email with a link. We're happy to provide that. But those will be good places to hear a little bit more about what's being proposed and also ask questions.
Thank you, Jenna. Maybe we could put those times and dates in the chat. That might be perfect. Okay. All right, I'm going to move into the 3rd piece here, which is the permitted and produced survey. Kind of just an update. I'm looking at you, Thea, if you could talk a little bit about that.
For sure. So many of you will recall that you saw the survey come through to you for permitted and produced data collection in July this year, which is different than what our full schedule had been. There was some explanation about that, and we don't need to dwell on it, but reach out if you are curious or have questions about the change in schedule there. The responses were due in late August, and they're currently under sort of processing and validation over at the Population Research Center at PSU, who are now stewarding the data collection of the permitted and produced survey. They will be handing that data over to OHCS sometime in the next month or so, and then OHCS will use that data to develop out the production dashboard, which will be updated annually early in the year. So just a sort of very high level update on where that data is. I know that it's, there are some changes to that permitted and produced survey beyond just the schedule that many of you have noted. You'll see that per legislation, especially around HB 2001, there was sort of more granular data that was requested. And so we're looking forward to working with you all to see where you're at with being able to collect that data and to understand what the challenges are. Please reach out if you have thoughts or ideas. We're going to be talking about this more, but getting that level of granularity is going to be pretty important going forward for several different initiatives. So thank you all for working with us. And again, let me know if you have questions. But for now, I think that's it. Back to you, Ethan.
Thank you. Yeah, any hold space and time there for any questions that might be relevant? Okay. We got a question there from Sandy. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Sandy, for that question. We need to track that. I mean, there are several reasons why tracking that level of granularity is important, but the main reason for us that we need to know is that it is required in HB 2001. So it's just a statutory direction now. So we need to make sure to ask you about that. And then, we'll be looking at how this middle housing, I mean, sort of more broadly as part of that conversation, more looking at to what level of uptake the different kinds of middle housing is happening at the local level. And that's pretty key to understanding how the legislation is coming down.
Yep. Yeah, and part of that distinction is to, I mean, broaden. Yes, it's required in HB 2001 from 2023. The like the reason why is to get a better, more clear sense of like what is the uptake and what are the stats? What's the how successful or not has the allowance of middle housing been in the state? And it also informs things like the housing production dashboard. There's other elements of other ways that information will be used in a more like publicly external facing for all of us to see, how the state's faring in middle housing production. As part of that, the 3 pillars of the ONA paradigm, tracking and monitoring being one of them. A couple of questions that sparked. Barbara, you first.
Yes, so we have a number of subdivisions that are not middle housing subdivisions, just regular subdivisions that are planned unit developments that are doing lot averaging. So some lots are larger, but the majority of them are becoming smaller and smaller with attached products that would be considered middle housing. But because it wasn't applied for under the middle housing code, does that mean that it doesn't apply in this count, or does it?
The survey should come with an embedded link with the definitions of how to define each housing type. And it's more about the built form than it is about what code path was utilized.
Great. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, there's that was one of the things that needed to be changed in the survey is because we heard a lot from jurisdictions like, is a cottage cluster just like 5 single units? Like, how do I put that in these buckets? And so the definitions and categorization was an important feature of this updated version. Eric.
Yeah, I had a question. It might be something you've already addressed as a part of the grants conversation in previous meetings, but I guess what I'm wondering is, as we try to sort of increase, as you've been saying, the granularity of our tracking and helping sort of come up with a system really internally to help us do that a bit better than we have been previously. I guess I'm wondering if there are any grant opportunities specific to tracking and monitoring, because we have noticed that, yeah, some of the things that we would like to be doing may cost some money. So just generally wondering about that.
good question. None specifically. And in fact, we actually got a couple applications to that, technical assistance grant applications to that effect, of trying to think through what that tracking process actually looks like. And I think at least from my personal perspective, happy to hear others' thoughts. I think the conversation around tracking and monitoring is an evolving one at the state legislature as well. And trying to keep true to, again, those kind of pillars of tracking, monitoring, outcomes, production, all of those kind of things. And that there may be, I don't know, some sort of state movement to that effect, and hoping to be able at that time to kind of think through a more systemic structural change, instead of like a piecemeal onesie twosie kind of approach. But I see Thea maybe has something to add.
Yeah, just that certainly everything that Ethan said is correct. We're, sort of looking at different ways that we can move forward to, as a state to support this this sort of level of data that we're asking cities to report, and make it, make that a less capacity, and time suck. But I do think that it's also important for your all voices to be heard on this. I think that hearing from local communities that this is something that they need support with, and that there's interest and flexibility in how you go about doing this data collection, and that you guys are willing partners in getting in there and understanding, the production that's happening on the ground in your cities, I think is really important, at the legislative level, and for other kinds of state leadership. So, let's just keep this conversation going, but I encourage you to definitely make sure that people know that this is something that's top of mind. There's one other thing that I thought of, but
Are there any opportunities where we can make our voices heard, I guess, in this process that you'd recommend that we sort of leverage?
I see Celestina.
I'm not sure that, for example, there's a public hearing on the topic or a committee hearing scheduled or anything like that. But what I did want to jump in terms of specifics, I'm glad you asked, Eric, is even sending in, I think, to us, and we can host and sort of ferry along to wherever the conversation goes, real specifics about what e-permitting software you're using. If you've gotten a quote from a consultant about what it's going to take to customize that for the city of Lake Oswego, or, however might apply, what does that quote look like? If you're not using the state provided Acela, why is, just like really getting underneath there to name the challenges that you're seeing in your city and applying, will really, I think, help folks see where the pain point is. So you all are welcome, and we'll of course drop our email in the chat, but to send the information at that level to us at any time, and we'll be able to do our best to hone in even closer.
Yeah, I think that's, I won't go as far as to say like use DLCD as your, lobbyist of sorts, but that information is definitely helpful if and when we find ourselves in that position of having those conversations with the state legislature, to be informed about like what cities and local governments actually need in that regard. So, but then also, the old standby of getting in touch with your own representatives and senators to move that conversation forward is always a good option as well.
Of course. Yeah, that sounds good. I think, we're still pretty low in terms of the actual numbers of middle housing produced, but if planners didn't have like a really keen sort of insight and sort of had been tracking that in other ways, I think it would be difficult just to look at this data set and have sort of somebody that's not involved in those processes kind of get the same data out of it. So that's kind of our concern, is just replicability, really. But anyway, I can send a lot more specifics. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Sandy.
Yeah, I just want to add on to the idea that I think I know not all jurisdictions use Acela, but a lot of them do. And so we've talked to Acela about adding a field where we could at the time, indicate whether it's one of these middle housing types so that it can be captured then. And of course, planners look at these definitions differently than builders. I mean, the building codes and such, but if if this is being accessed statewide, I would love it if DLCD could coordinate, jurisdictions to see, is there interest in taking that approach? Would that work for other cities? And if so, working with BCD or whoever manages the Acela contract. And that would streamline things for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Yes, and that is to my understanding who manages the Acela contract for the state. This is a little bit of dipping into the Housing Accountability and Production Office territory here, but there is, I'll just highlight a study that office is conducting called what it basically amounts to like a process improvement or like a state audit of barriers or things related to housing production that could be like in the spirit of state agency coordination and with removing state, I don't know, created barriers to production or any of those pillars, which might be something that we want to highlight is kind of like raise out of this conversation. We've heard it throughout other conversations as well, but the ability for the state to provide resources and templates and tools, methodologies, like maybe even actual software to local governments to, more standardize that kind of reporting so that everybody's on the same page in terms of like, what do we call an attached, 4-unit structure? Is that a fourplex or is that a townhouse? Or like, how do we try to identify those things a little bit more clearly so that we do have a good sense of, what the outcomes actually are, what the results of all of this effort actually is. Okay. Really good conversation there. Thank you for that. Holding that for another beat there, if there's any further thoughts or reflections. Okay. All right, we'll move into the final set of our scheduled or more structured agenda, which is kind of the 25-27 rulemaking process that we're getting kicked off here imminently. There were 2 bills passed in the 25 legislative session that direct DLCD to conduct rulemaking. The first is House Bill 2138. This is the governor's omnibus housing policy bill, but there's a focus on, in terms of rulemaking related to siting and design standards for a few housing types: middle housing, single room occupancies, and accessory dwelling units, and then a little bit deeper into that, particularly manufactured and prefabricated versions of those housing types. And kind of sets DLCD on the course to basically make an updated set of, or recommend an updated set of siting and design standards to further incentivize and encourage the development of middle housing in the state. That piece of legislation is based on, the 5 years of learned lessons from middle housing the first go around, and seeks to further take down some of those barriers to that middle housing production in the state. And that rulemaking has a deadline of January 1st of 2028. So we'll be in rulemaking, updating those versions alongside with all of you and whoever's interested in following along over the course of that time period. And the rulemaking process, or the kind of initiation of that rulemaking process from the Land Conservation and Development Commission, is also taking place on October 23rd, the same day that we're holding that public hearing for the owner rulemaking, kind of kicking off the next phase of rulemaking. So that's one. The second one is House Bill 2258. This is generally referred to as the Oregon Homes Bill. So that directs both DLCD and the Building Codes Division of the Department of Consumer and Business Services to craft a program around these Oregon homes. And an Oregon home is the matching of a pre-approved permit, pre-approved building plan with a eligible and basically pre-approved site. So BCD, the Building Codes Division, is identifying and creating, developing their own set of pre-approved building plans. And they're also taking applications from builders for their own kind of like proprietary building plans, pre-approving those at the state level and saying, hey, these meet all of the state code, the applicable state codes, and they're like ready to go right off the shelf. DLCD's portion of that rulemaking is to identify the criteria for eligible lots that could have an Oregon home developed on that site. So that rulemaking at DLCD would be along the lines of saying, okay, you have a lot of a particular size, it meets these, I don't know, particular dimensionality kind of elements, it's in a particular location, it's got the right zoning, so on and so forth, and it meets these eligible criteria. And if a property owner has both a eligible lot and they're using a pre-approved building plan, an Oregon home from Building Codes Division, they go right to approval to begin construction of that project. So that rulemaking also, again, being kicked off on the 23rd of October in front of LCDC, has a 1 year shorter rulemaking timeline. So those rules need to be adopted by commission January 1st of 2027. So we'll be back in front of LCDC in short order to have those eligible lots identified in that criteria in administrative rules. Obviously, that requires all sorts of coordination back and forth between DLCD and Building Codes Division to make sure that those pre-approved Oregon homes actually meet the eligibility requirements that are identified in the site approval, and back and forth, vice versa. Barbara.
I guess I'm full of questions today. Thank you.
That's great.
So I'm wondering how the connection permits will be handled for utilities, and then who will be responsible for inspecting if it doesn't get reviewed at the local level?
All really good questions that I do not have the answer for you at this current moment. Although I will give my my understanding of how that's envisioned. Granted, all of this is, needs further conversation, but that those responsibilities of the reviewing the connections and the inspections would be at the local level. But still maintain those review opportunities.
But I'm confused. If you're not looking at the plans for how they fit together, how are you, you said they go right to construction.
Okay, I'm
So
sorry.
how would you have something to review to know that they're connecting it correctly? So
Yeah.
that's the disconnect that I'm not getting.
Yeah.
And I hope that you guys will explore that as you go through your next process.
Yeah, apologies. I used the probably incorrect language there, but the House Bill 2258 sets LCDC or directs LCDC to establish what that review process looks like at the local government level. So not straight to construction. I suppose there is a gate to walk through at the local level to get that approval. So the local government actually has eyes on the thing before, walls are going up or there's any kind of development activity happening on the site. So,
Okay, thank you.
but what that review process is a subject of the rulemaking. Like what process can a city apply to that review? Okay. Just kind of tie a quick bow again, just reiterate something for these two pieces of rulemaking, the commission will initiate and like take a vote to set the department on the course of conducting that rulemaking at their meeting on the 23rd of October. At that point, we'll open up applications for rulemaking advisory committee members and technical advisory committee membership, and kind of moving into planning for those first kickoff meetings and then the rulemaking meetings from there over the course of 26 and 27. Okay. That brings us to the end of kind of our scheduled agenda. Happy at this point in time to field any questions that folks have, or also hand this off to any of the rest of the housing division folks or the regional reps to share any other tidbits as well. Get comfortable into that uncomfortable silence. Okay. Cassandra has a good question. And I thought I saw Ryan Marquardt might be in the audience. But the question is there an update for when 2138 and Senate Bill 974 guidance will be published? And Ryan, if you heard me, or anybody else from HAPO here, issued this week. Look at that. So that sounds exciting, and I look forward to reviewing that with local governments. Should they have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to the good folks at HAPO on with those questions. Okay. There are maybe one additional flag kind of related to this last topic, which is 25-27 rulemaking. We're still in the process of reviewing the Senate Bill 974 to determine when or if there is a need for what's called conforming rulemaking related to the provisions in that bill. So the big thing in Senate Bill 974 is that it plays around with the design standards that a local government can apply to particular housing developments. And that might have created just a, not necessarily a conflict, but it just changed the paradigm in terms of which middle housing design standards apply in particular instances. And so there might be a necessity to go back into Division 46 related to middle housing and do some cleanup prior to the adoption of the impacts that Senate Bill 2138 are making on a longer time frame. So to say that again, because I'm sure that was kind of confusing, we might be going through a conforming, very quick rulemaking process just to conform Division 46 to Senate Bill 974 in the interim as a kind of like stopgap, just make sure that the language from administrative rules matches statute, while we're also updating Division 46 on a longer time frame to be concluded January 1st, 2028. So we might be dipping into that that division more than once over the next couple of years. Josh.
Hey, Ethan. Along those lines, I guess I'm doing the housing analysis and things. I put the grant in for that. I did not put a grant in for technical assistance for code updates, even though my code is completely blown up. It's like a moving target. So I'm curious how people are updating their codes when they're not even sure what's coming next, and we're constantly moving, and we're getting trapped in these. It's like changing the tire while you're driving a car. You're not sure exactly what to change it to, and then it changes again. And so we're going through these amendment processes. Is there going to come a point where the state just says, here's your land use code, and we just stop doing amendments? Because I feel like I'm becoming an agent of the state in that way. And is that easier? Is there
Well,
going
I
to be a
certainly-
model ordinance that just says this is how housing is done in the state of Oregon? You guys take care of commercial and industrial,
Mm,
or that's it's not really a question. It's more of like, is that the
Right.
ultimate goal? Because we're chasing our tail.
totally hear that, see that, understand that. In terms of the moving target that's that exists. I don't, I'm not going to speculate on your other point. But there is movement towards providing a set of model development codes, especially through like the passage of Senate Bill 1564 that directs the state DLCD to adopt model residential codes for different population threshold cities. There's
Okay.
3 different population thresholds that are at this point in time not required to be used, but are certainly incentivized in things like the housing production strategy portion of the Goal 10 process.
Right.
And
Is that coming? You know when that's coming out?
yeah, as part of this Oregon Housing Needs Analysis rulemaking process. So
Oh, it is. Okay.
October
It is part of that.
23rd, all of that kind of that same timeline.
Okay. Because I
but
kind of
yeah.
need to do that first, and then that, I don't know, kind of directs my code. But in the meantime, I'm just caught in the middle, and that's
Right. Yeah, and
becoming a
that
sticking point.
right. The timeline for the use and the utility and the consideration of that model code is, once it's published, obviously you could use it as a resource however you so choose. But the actual, when a local government's going to be diving into that is going to be at the time they're conducting their housing production strategy. They've got some decisions to make on which, course of action they're going to be implementing as part of that housing production strategy. One of those options could be implementing the state's model code. That's definitely an option. But to your point of like trying to catch your tail, thankfully, whether or not it was enough or that it's sufficient, those bills that have been changing the development landscape and the development regulatory landscape for middle housing have come with technical assistance dollars. So 2138 does come with technical assistance. That's also a role that the Housing Accountability and Production Office plays, of providing technical resources for local governments to bring their codes up to date, and that persists, that exists now and will in the future, and those aren't tied to those biennial timeline cycles and can be kind of invoked on an ongoing basis. So there are opportunities to do that. Granted, can local government planners who are already strapped for time and capacity begin to direct attention to that? That's certainly another question.
Right.
But
The last one I
every
did, I
time-
did
yeah.
House Bill 2001. That was a pretty easy update, but at this point, it's a complete rewrite.
Yep.
And that's what makes it difficult for us. So all the grant money for technical assistance was in this biennium. Is there next year? Is there going to be any more, or we looking at 28, 29, 30?
Well, we'll see what happens in the short session. I
See. Okay, because next year they could allocate more. Okay.
Right. I don't know. Usually those like funding bills, though, I will say, come with or are a part of like a policy bill. So you would only get additional technical resources if there was like another change to statute. So that's not helping all that much. Although I will say that yes, there was a big splash in terms of allocation and earmarking of technical assistance that we just made last week. And that was kind of like a all in, at least from the housing division's perspective. There's, we have some contingency funds to make sure that we can fund all the projects, but there's the Housing Accountability and Production Office does not do it that way. And instead they hold back some reserve funds for cities that have, come to the conclusion or off kind of like quote unquote off cycle inquiries in terms of needing resources to that effect. And those funds aren't tied to the biennial cycle. And
Okay.
projects can span these like odd numbered years. A city in theory could start a HAPO project in May of 27, even though the biennial close is right there in June of 27, and complete the project on a timeline that's going to work best for the jurisdiction. And HAPO's dollars are really kind of keenly focused on compliance with state housing laws. So
Right,
those
and
kind of
that's what I'm
things,
gonna
yeah,
I'm gonna need. I just need to get
Right.
these other things out of the way
exactly.
so I know what to change things to. So that's okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So the HAPO funds are much more flexible in that regard and are probably better suited to what you're needing there, Josh. Okay. And yeah, Ryan, I mean, feel free to jump in, correct, amend, all that kind of stuff related to HAPO that I just mentioned. Let's see. Questions in the chat. Let's see if I can follow along here. Okay, question about just the way in which the new model codes will be shown. We've typically done the practice of like a track changes version. Granted, that works better for rules than it does for like a model code. But I think we can check in with Sean Edging, who's now at HAPO, but is leading this Senate Bill 1564 model code development to just see what the plan is for publishing an updated version. So we can check in on that and provide, pass along your preference for those updates and changes from June to October's version to be a little bit more clear, whether it's in narrative form or comments or track changes or something. Okay, I don't know. I think I have all the things in the chat. Let me know if I'm missing anything. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions? Okay. Well, we've got, I guess I'll kind of wrap it up and move us towards closing, but I don't want to close out any questions or comments that folks have. So feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me. Fred,
Hey,
yeah.
hey, Ethan. It sounds like somebody has a question about pre-approved plans and design standards, and I think I have the same question, and I don't think that you've addressed that.
Okay, let's see. Whoever has that question, it would be great if you could. It's getting a little lost in the chat. I apologize. If anybody.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same sort of question that we have. We have design standards that we apply to new homes and independence. And I guess how will the pre-approved plans play with our design standards?
So I think the answer to that question is that the pre-approved plans are not subject to the local government's design standards. I think there's a question though, but like the actual building itself, right? Those are like a right off the shelf developed, ability, like you can get approval right from the jump on those. I think there is a question though, which is the subject of the rulemaking process of, are there other things like landscaping standards or like, I don't know, orientation standards that might be still applicable, or is there just a eligibility criteria that kind of moves a builder right along without consideration of those design standards that are not related to the actual building themselves and more like site design. So I guess that's a long way of saying it will be ironed out in the rulemaking process, or is that's actually explicitly outlined in the charge in 2258. So I look forward to
Okay.
having that conversation as part of the rulemaking process.
Sounds good.
But I think like the general premise though is that that's a pretty smooth pathway towards approval. That there's likely very little or a very minimal set of standards that can be applied to an Oregon home development, both on the site and the building. So Brandon, so tree protection is called out in the actual piece of legislation. So there are some particular preservation items there. Solar setback requirements, riparian areas are, I believe there's a notwithstanding provision that would have those not be applicable, but don't hold me to that. I need to dive into the legislation a little bit more closely. They're called out specifically, right, in the first section, the eligibility criteria. Or examples of them. Yeah, Josh, I think to your point, that eligibility criteria for the site plan review process is seeking to incorporate consideration of setbacks, lot coverage, those kinds of things into identifying what is an eligible lot. So one approach that could be used is this example of like an imaginary shape and saying like, if you fit this box somewhere on the site, then it's eligible for use of an Oregon home, for example. Not saying that that's the way that rulemaking would go, but that's potentially one way to kind of think about it, is that, in creating that box, you can incorporate the concepts of lot coverage and setbacks into the consideration of what those design standards are and what the eligibility criteria, how they manifest. That's right, Mark. Yes. So they'd be pre-approved from the building codes division. So those experts in all of those codes would be the ones who are reviewing them at a statewide level and saying, hey, we can apply these, or they should be able to meet all of these other applicable codes. Barbara.
So in Washington County, we have clean water services standards that require water quality and quantity detention. And while a standard lot may fit a house, sometimes the water quality and quantity might affect how that house is able to be built on that lot. Either maybe it can't be as big as the applicant wants, or any number of things. How will those clean water services regulations fall into review for these pre-approved plans?
Yeah, really good question.
Because seemingly it could be a perfect fit, but for those regulations.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's another example of one of those things that, in terms of how you structure it and how it actually works in implementation, will be ironed out in the rulemaking process. So those in the who'll be working on that rulemaking. Hopefully we're taking some notes on how that can unfold.
Thank
Or
you.
the questions to consider. Yeah, certainly, at least what I'm familiar with in terms of legislation and rule making is that the pieces of legislation aren't specific to answering those kind of detailed questions and how the implementation is actually going to work, but that is explicitly and directly the kind of conversation that the rulemaking process is intended to untangle and try to address. Let's see, how many pre-approved? That's a good question. So Building Codes Division is directed to create a handful of them on their own through their what's called the master plan process at Building Codes Division. So, and it articulates the specific housing type. So it's like a single unit detached version. There's an ADU version, middle housing. And then there's also an opportunity for builders to come and apply through the master plan process to get their own building plans approved from the state. So that, Building Codes Division has a small subset, but there's no cap on what other pre-approved plans could be approved to be Oregon homes. Because it's subject to builders, how many they apply for and how many Building Codes Division actually approves. And that's a rolling process. There's no start and close to that application process. It's at any time. Let's see. Okay, attached. Does this apply to attached housing such as triplexes or quads? And can a legislative PUD override these rulemaking objectives? So I think this is again kind of in terms of the process that an approval criteria and process that a local government would apply to these instances, but I can envision a structure that does not, that it comes after the PUD or subdivision process that then begins the Oregon home approval. So very similar to the way that a middle housing land division process works in conjunction with like a traditional subdivision, is that a local government can apply their traditional subdivision process to create, all of the, various tracks and, public access things and stormwater retention and all of that kind of stuff as part of that traditional subdivision. And then on the individual lots that take place, all of those individual lots are subject then to the potential for use of a middle housing land division. So very similar. I could envision a structure that's very similar in the Oregon homes concept of saying, builder's not entitled to use of Oregon homes in the traditional subdivision process, but development of each of those individual lots could utilize the tool. So it's kind of a two-step, multi-step process that I could see would make a lot of sense there. And the attached version of those developments, middle housing is one of those potential Oregon home concepts, which would include attached versions. So that is the intent of the bill, is to have those attached versions be classified and receive the same benefit of the Oregon homes provisions and under the bill. Okay, good questions. Okay. A natural lull in the process or in the conversation. So I'll move us into some just a little bit of closing here. So We hold these meetings every even numbered month with the housing division. They're with things related to all of the stuff we've been talking about today. That means our next meeting is scheduled for December 1st. And I actually might propose a slight tweak of that timeline, considering that's just a couple days before the Land Conservation Development Commission hears the ONA rules, which is going to be a highly busy time for DLCD staff, and also might be kind of better for folks to hear the results of what transpired at the hearing. So I'm proposing that we shift that meeting actually 1 week out to December 8th, just so we can do a little bit of like digestion and talk through the decisions that were made by LCDC as part of those rules. So just a note for both DLCD internally that we might want to change that date, and for you all as you're planning your next couple months out. And then finally, just kind of hit those dates again. So Thursday this week on the 9th, DLCD will be publishing the packet of materials for LCDC. That'll include those rules in a more digestible manner. It'll also include model codes pieces. It will include the staff report articulation of what those proposed rules are intended to do and how the process or how those rules provide additional clarity and reduce analytical burden in this process. It will also include a staff report related to the initiation of these two new rulemaking efforts under 2138 and 2258. That leads us to the 23rd of October. That's the public hearing date and the initiation date. That'll be a busy LCDC agenda in terms of housing. The public comment period on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis rules is held open until the 7th of November. So you can provide any written or verbal testimony up until that point. And then the adoption hearing is scheduled for December 4th in front of LCDC. And then finally on the grants, just the next steps, we'll be in touch with those local governments who received a intent to award in the next couple of weeks, kicking off that kind of grant agreement process pretty soon here. I think that's plenty for now. Yes, Celestina, please.
Yeah, I just figured, and forgive me if you mentioned it, I was trying to track the list as well, but that of course on the other months, there's the Housing Accountability and Production Office open fora on that first Monday of the month. And that is of course a joint office between DLCD and the Building Codes Division over at Department of Consumer and Business Services. So some of the questions that you all posed today, we were able to provide, I think, pretty decent insights into, but could also be topics for some of the folks and some of the scopes of that call. So just a reminder, maybe I should have pulled up the exact date in front of me, but next one will be first Monday of November, unless otherwise rescheduled, but to the best of my knowledge, 1 p.m.
Yeah, so if you're interested in talking to housing with DLCD, the first Monday of every month is your day. You're either with HAPO or you're with Housing Division. So we're trying to be as available as we can. And in the outside of those times, feel free to send an email to either your regional reps or use the housing email address that's been in the chat a couple times. We're happy to answer questions as you have them. All right, y'all. I will dismiss us for today, and I look forward to chatting with you all soon.